Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Zeiker. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to this online discussion of electric vehicle policies and the obstacles confronting a widespread adoption of electric vehicles, as we're seeing in the news recently. I think we have an excellent discussion planned, beginning with Mr. Andrew Wheeler, the former administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. So, Mr. Wheeler, we're looking forward to your opening comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Ben. Thank you for everyone at AEI for inviting me to participate today. We have a great event with a very distinguished panel following me. And it's interesting, the topic of this conversation, electric vehicles, policies, and obstacles. And I'm sure not just myself, but the panelists are probably going to focus on the obstacles. And I'm going to name a few of the obstacles that we have, but it doesn't mean that we don't support EV vehicles. I do. I don't own one, but I've looked into buying one. It doesn't make sense for me at this point in my life. But the problem that we have, and the overarching problem that I think we're seeing with today's discussion, is when the federal government or a state government mandates a new technology or an emerging technology, and EVs are still new and emerging, and when it outpaces the ability of the technology companies, the manufacturers to keep pace with what the expectations are by the government. So it's really how the government policies have contributed to creating obstacles that wouldn't necessarily be there if the technology were allowed to proceed at a normal rate based on consumer demand and consumer acceptance of whatever the product is. And this has been true in particular in the energy field for years. When the federal government has gotten involved in energy, the federal government tends to make mistakes. And the federal government, I believe, has gotten too involved in promoting the use of EVs, and we're seeing what some of those mistakes are today. Americans are buying more electric cars than before. As of this past November, EVs hit 1 million sold in a calendar year for the first time ever. But that is, of course, out of 14.5 million sold for the year. However, that's after Congress spent over $7.5 billion on new chargers in grants to states through the Inflation Reduction Act. They spent that money, 3 years ago now, but the first charger using those funds didn't open until this past October. And EV buyers can receive up to $7,500 in rebates. Yet again, I want to say this number, 1 million out of 14.5 million sold last year. President Biden and the Biden administration are trying to force consumer acceptance. He has pledged to have half of all vehicles sold by 2030 to be EVs. His new EPA rule would require 67% of new cars to be electric by 2032. Although in the last few days, there's been announcements that the EPA is going to scale back that proposal, in large part because of political influence by the United Auto Workers and the Biden administration in January of this year, and the fact that this is an election year. But Americans are still very weary of EVs. They have concerns about the availability of charging stations. They have concerns about how far the range of the EVs are, and of course, the higher cost. What do we know today? We know that EVs aren't selling as fast. While I mentioned the statistic from November of hitting 1 million sold in the calendar year, as of November also, traditional cars stayed on the car lots for 70 days, while EVs were on the car lots for 117 days. People are making their choices with their pocketbook in which cars they purchase. The resale of EVs still doesn't hold up as well as traditional cars. Wealthy and upper middle class are still the predominant purchasers, which means that the tax credits are going to people who don't need it. And when there is an accident and the battery is at all damaged, insurance companies are totaling the car and the owner receives very little compensation. These concerns are starting to filter into consumer choice as people make their choices of which cars they want to purchase. Ford recently announced that their projected loss of $5 to $5.5 billion through their EV division this year. And GM is hoping to break even if they can reach projection rates of 200 to 300,000 of new EV sales. What are we ignoring? We are ignoring the fact that batteries are still very dependent upon rare earth minerals. We're also ignoring the energy use needs for electric vehicles and the recycling and disposal of the old EV batteries. We do not have the energy infrastructure to power 50% of EVs by 2030. And we have no real plan to reach that goal. That will require a lot of new electricity generation, as well as the electric infrastructure through the grid to power the EV charging that the Biden administration plans to have by 2030. And again, the EPA rule would have set the electric vehicles 67% by 2032. And although the Biden administration has said that they're going to scale that back, they're not planning on scaling it back very much. And if there is a second Biden administration, I'm willing to bet that that number will go back up. Second, on mining, we are highly dependent on other countries for the rare earth minerals that make up the EV batteries. 85% of rare earth minerals come from China. Cobalt and lithium are two of the main components of the EV batteries. Cobalt is mined in Congo and China by children and forced labor. While we have rare earth minerals here in the United States, it's very difficult to access them. When I was EPA administrator, I worked hard to get a cobalt mine permitted in the state of Missouri. We have rare earth minerals in many states, including Alaska. But the Biden administration has done everything they can to slow down the access to those minerals here in the United States. They've blocked new mining areas by wilderness designations. They reversed our NEPA modernization regulations to make it harder to permit large projects across the country. And they have an outright hostility to new permitting for mining projects across the country. When you mine rare earth minerals, the techniques that are used, particularly in China, the Congo, and other countries, include a lot of chemicals and the creation of leaching ponds. If those materials were mined here in the United States, we have the gold standard of environmental regulations and permitting of anywhere in the world. And we would mine those products in an environmentally conscious manner compared to what China or the Congo or other countries are doing when they mine their materials. There is no comparison in the environmental regulations and the environmental permitting that we have compared to Africa or China. So while we are blocking the mining of those materials here in the United States, we are therefore subjecting the world to horrible environmental practices, horrible mining practices, child labor, forced labor, and waste that is being created in other countries that is destroying the environment there. We can mine and protect the environment here in the United States and access the materials that we need for EV batteries. And then finally, the end of the use lifespan of the EV batteries. We do not have a national plan. In fact, most of the world does not have a national plan on how to recycle or dispose of EV batteries. EVs reach the end of their life with approximately 70 to 80% of the original capacity intact. Today, in the United States, EV batteries come with a warranty of 100,000 miles or 8 years, but they can be replaced if they can't hold a charge. And some companies will change out the batteries if the charging lifespan drops below 60 to 70%. A battery loses its charge capability approximately 2 to 3% each year, but that varies depending upon the charging habits of the consumer, the environmental area, meaning it's harder for it to keep its charge if it's cold or too hot, and other charging practices. It can shorten the lifespan of the battery. When the battery is replaced, the old batteries can be recycled, but worldwide, only 5% of batteries are recycled. The most common recycling method here in the United States is shredding the battery and separating the metals, but this wastes most of the lithium. Up to 50% of the materials in the battery can be recycled, but it is more expensive to recover lithium from a recycled battery than it is to mine new lithium through mining practices, which has made recycling uneconomical. So what happens to the batteries when they're collected? They either end up in many companies are doing this, storing the batteries in warehouses in hopes that the recycling costs come down, or sending them to waste sites. But we don't have a clear plan on how to treat batteries at waste facilities around the country. Batteries with the toxic materials that they have inside, or they're also flammable, and they can create hazardous sites at our waste disposal sites around the country. In addition, if they are stored in warehouses waiting for recycling, they can degrade, the minerals can leach out, and we can create cleanup problems at those facilities around the country. The infrastructure bill that the Biden administration passed through Congress contained a small amount of funding for recycling, to study recycling. It's, in my opinion, extremely lopsided. They're pushing for 67% of EV batteries by 2032, but they aren't looking at the end of the lifespan. The decisions that we make today and over the next few years could easily create the Superfund sites of the future if we're not careful on how we recycle or how we dispose of the EV batteries. Again, while this may sound pessimistic towards EVs, I am a big supporter of EVs. I think they're important. I think they are an important part of our future and an important part of our transportation system. But when the government steps in, when the federal government or state government step in and mandate the use of any source, such as EV batteries and EV cars, they have to have the plan in place, one, to access the minerals that needed to create the batteries, and then two, the waste disposal and recycling infrastructure in place for the end of life disposal of the batteries. With that, I would be happy to take any questions. Ben, I think you're on mute.
Very good. Well, thank you. That was really an extremely informative, useful summary of the issues and outlook. And it was really quite well done. Thank you very much. Let me ask you, at a very crude level, it strikes me that the ambitions are unachievable, at least in the short run, on the part of the Biden administration. I just don't see how we're going to get 2/3 EVs by much less than a decade from now, et cetera. What do you think is the end game or the medium-term end game of all this politically? Will they simply keep moving the goalpost back so that the instead of 2032 becomes 2035 or 2040. How do you think this will play out given the very, very difficult outlook for achieving the market shares that are have been promulgated?
I think you're correct. I think the years will just be pushed out into the future. And you're right. It's impossible for us to achieve 2/3 by 2030 or 2032. And the Biden administration, it's interesting. Well, on the one hand, they are they are mandating through EPA regulation. On the other hand, some of their policies are against the use of EVs. As I mentioned, the permitting, um, that's going to harm EVs. The infrastructure demands on the energy side is going to harm the use of EVs. And then it's this past year, the CAFE standards are a very complicated calculation. Each auto company has to have a fleet average. And there has been what's called a multiplier for EV cars. So you average out the sales of all of your automobiles. EV cars, I'm just gonna throw a number out there, say 50 miles per gallon equivalent. Um, there has been in place for at least a decade a multiplier that if you for the EV cars, you multiply that by, I believe it's 6. So that goes into the average. So that bumps up the average for the fleet average for EV cars. And the Biden administration proposed doing away with the multiplier this past year to treat EV cars the way they would any other automobile, which is going to severely hamper the auto companies from meeting their CAFE standards. In the past, again, the numbers were geared towards helping giving more credit for EV sales, and they're taking that away. So it's really a left hand, right hand in the Biden administration on promoting and discouraging at the same time. Um, but you're right. We're not going to meet it, and they're going to have to keep changing the dates like they're proposing to do now.
All right, let me follow up with one question, if I may. Given that the natural response of the administration will be to move the goalposts more than one time because of the impossibility of reaching the goals, uh, what do the car manufacturers do? How do they make their plans? How do they make their investments? What happens to the capital stock used to produce internal combustion engine cars? It strikes me that you wind up over time with a policy that generates almost literally chaos in the domestic automotive sector, and I don't see how they get around that. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe there's a way to avoid that problem, but I don't see how the auto manufacturers can structure their planning and investment programs to meet an ever-changing set of due dates.
Well, the cynic, I think, would say that they're just going to ignore the requirements that are that far out, the 2030, 2032 requirements. It appears as though that, GM and Ford are looking more at hybrids instead of straight out EVs, which is more acceptable to consumers, but will not get anywhere near the targets that the Biden administration has set. And I think that the auto industry was hoping that the tax credits would spur more sales, but what we found again is that it's the same segment of society that are purchasing the AVs is upper middle class and wealthy people. They're still priced higher when an EV costs 50 some thousand and you can buy a small compact for $24,000. Lower middle class or are going to buy either a used car or a cheaper car. They're not going to purchase this. The tax credit doesn't help them. So I think what you're seeing is reality setting in. It's a shame that, Ford, when I said they announced losing $5 to $5.5 billion on their EV program, their EV division, that's going to be passed on to consumers in the price of all automobiles going forward. Companies don't just take a loss without passing those costs on. So this has been a social experiment over the last 3 years that, quite frankly, has failed and is going to end up costing the American consumer quite a bit.
Okay, well, with that, let me thank you, Mr. Wheeler, again for an extremely informative and useful introduction to this event. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for
We
inviting
hope
me.
you're able to remain with us, but I know that you're quite busy and you may have to leave. But we thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let me turn now to our first panelist, Jonathan Brightbill, a partner at Winston and Strawn and a former acting assistant attorney general at the Department of Justice. Jonathan, go ahead.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you to the American Enterprise Institute for hosting this discussion and inviting me to participate. It's an honor to follow my former colleague and client, Administrator Wheeler, and to continue and kind of supplement his remarks during my time at the Department of Justice. I signed my name to more than, we'll call it dozens and dozens of pleadings that were defending the policies of Administrator Wheeler and others. So my role here today is to talk about the major legal battles that are raging around electric vehicles and to give a little of the history of how we got here. Before I do that, I want to reiterate Administrator Wheeler's comments that the issue here is not whether EVs are per se good or EVs are per se bad. In fact, the market has demonstrated that there are at least some segments of consumers that are very interested in electric vehicles, and that electric vehicles have found uses in certain environments, certain cities, certain places, certain use cases. But the issue ultimately isn't then whether EVs should or should not be on the market. The issue is really about whether the policies that have been put forth by the federal and certain state governments, primarily California, which seek to transition the country to electric vehicles, are lawful and ultimately rational and supported by records that the administrative agencies of the country are required to develop in the advancement of their rulemakings, regulations, and the like. So today, the battle is playing out over three predominant dimensions. There are, first of all, legal challenges that relate to California's authority to mandate electric vehicles, including both EPA's decision to allow California to do that, because it's been established that California needs a waiver from the federal government, from the EPA, in order to do that. And second, whether such standards, even if the EPA grants such a waiver under the Clean Air Act, are nevertheless preempted by the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, and in particular, the fuel economy regulations and program that have been developed and implemented by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, over the many decades. So the legal challenges over EPA's mandated transition to electric vehicles are then the second bucket of issue, which is California's doing its thing. That's bucket one. Bucket two is EPA, notwithstanding that California is pushing the envelope in its own way, has now, as Administrator Wheeler was referencing, set forth various policies and really aggressive standards that, again, seek to force a transition to electric vehicles. And so there's active litigation about whether EPA has the authority to institute such a transition in the manner in which they're instituting it, and the rationality, again, of EPA's reasons for doing so. And lastly, then, the third bucket of what I'll call major litigation concerns the fuel economy standards of the natural net of NHTSA, and whether NHTSA is also itself improperly mandating a transition to electric vehicles with standards. So all of these kind of three buckets are wrapped up in various petitions for review, rulemaking challenges, which are being considered right now by the DC Circuit. There were arguments in September of 2023, and we'll come to that in a little bit later in my remarks. But in terms of background, the legal battles over electric vehicles have actually now been going on for almost 2.5 decades. I was actually an associate recently out of law school back in 2001 when I worked on the first of these battles relating to electric vehicles, which was a lawsuit brought on behalf of GM, Ford, and Chrysler against the state of California. Now, back in those days, this was before there was a discussion of electric vehicles as a means really for mitigating climate change, and really a focus on electric vehicles as a means of addressing conventional criteria pollutants. California had a zero emission vehicle mandate, which was first adopted in 1990. So we're talking 35 years ago now. And that mandated that 10% of cars in California should be essentially electric vehicles, but have no pollution, conventional pollution emissions at the end of the next decade. This optimistic program was based on GM's debut of a prototype battery electric vehicle at the Los Angeles Auto Show in 1990, and GM's optimism that it could successfully bring this product to the market on a competitive basis with internal combustion engine vehicles in California over the next decade. Now, as that decade of the 90s began to run out, CARB and the auto industry generally recognized a problem. And some of these issues may sound vaguely familiar to policymakers in 2024 and reminiscent of what Administrator Wheeler was just discussing, which is that battery technology had failed to progress as expected. The range on these vehicles was limited. Recharge times were long. The availability of charging infrastructure was scarce. And therefore, consumer willingness to pay simply didn't match up with the anticipated increased cost of producing these vehicles and trying to produce these vehicles at scale. They were a niche product that was based on the Saturn with very acute interest by a limited subset of vehicle buyers and drivers with particular driving patterns in California. And it was obviously of high level of interest to the California government. But by the late 1990s, it was clear that California's ZEV mandate could not be achieved. And California responded to this by converting its ZEV mandate into, in effect, a hybrid electric vehicle mandate. And California recognized, took advantage of the correlation that exists, very logical correlation between gallons of fuel being burned and expended and, excuse me, sorry about that, and pollutions which come out of a vehicle tailpipe. So with that recognition, they mandated through a variety of mechanisms that manufacturers essentially would have to achieve specified levels of fuel economy across their various vehicle classes by certain dates. A number of local automobile dealers in California, including backstopped then by General Motors, Chrysler, Ford, sued and argued that California's de facto fuel economy regulation was preempted by the Energy Policy Conservation Act of 1975 and secured a preliminary injunction from the district court stopping that program. Now, because California agreed to go back to the drawing board, the dispute was temporarily resolved. But ironically, here we are now, more than 20 years later, and many of the questions that were presented in that very, very first lawsuit 24 years ago remain undecided and unsettled by any court of appeals. The latest round of litigation, which is now culminated in the current cases in the DC Circuit, really then traced to California's decision in the mid 2000s to begin regulating greenhouse gas emissions specifically, and therefore pushing a transition to electric vehicles for that particular purpose. Now, when California first embarked on this, it still had, of course, its zero emission vehicle mandate. But what it was now trying to do was, under the auspices of greenhouse gas emissions, stepped very clearly into the auspices of the preemption provisions of the Clean Air Act. So that's the Clean Air Act, Title II, differs from Title I of the Clean Air Act, which is a program of cooperative federalism, right? In Title I, which relates to stationary sources, the federal government sets standards, and states then create implementation plans that are tailored to their own states in order to meet those standards. Title II, automobile regulation, has been different from the beginning. The federal government recognizes and has recognized that cars move around the country and can move around the country, and that auto dealers sell and distribute cars on a national basis. And so a hodgepodge of individual state standards is not a sensible policy. And so going all the way back to 1967, there has been a preemption provision that precludes states from adopting standards that are different from those of the federal government. Nevertheless, this statute contained a carve-out which was inserted in 1967. And that carve-out was specifically to allow supposedly any state which had previously adopted motor vehicle emission standards to be able to receive a waiver under the subsection B of the preemption provision from the federal government to be able to continue their programs. As it turns out, there was, as in 1967, only one state that had such a program and that qualified for this waiver, and everybody knew it, and that was the state of California. So there was also then, of course, a secondary issue with respect to California's program, which was the previously mentioned EPCA standard. Through the earlier litigation efforts that I made reference to, California had learned some lessons, and notwithstanding that fact, the automakers sued again, recognizing that there is a direct mathematical scientific relationship between the grams of carbon dioxide emitted by an internal combustion engine per mile and the miles a vehicle can travel per gallon of gasoline burned. In other words, carbon dioxide emissions and a carbon dioxide emission standard of grams of carbon dioxide per mile is the flip side of a fuel economy standard with the mathematical inputs algebraically moved around. They are, in effect, two sides of the same coin. And so with that, another round of litigation then began over the preemption of California's new greenhouse gas program. So initially, the program was preempted because there was a lack of a waiver under the Clean Air Act, but a couple of district courts determined that given how California had rejiggered this program, and that the EPCA statute would not actually preempt California's new program. So with that, enter the federal government. California applied for a Clean Air Act waiver from EPA during the administration of George W. Bush. It was denied. The Obama administration came in and quickly reversed, therefore granting California a waiver to begin regulating automobile greenhouse gas emissions under its state program. During the Trump administration, Administrator Wheeler made the determination to withdraw California's waiver. And when the Biden administration came in, they quickly reversed that yet again. So Meanwhile, on a parallel track, both EPA and NHTSA have continued to take similar actions over time with respect to greenhouse gas emissions as it relates to automobiles in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision in Massachusetts of the EPA. In 2010, the Obama administration entered into a grand deal, so to speak, with the automobile industry and labor interests in California and others, and put in place standards whereby both EPA and NHTSA on a parallel track put in aggressive standards that over the course of the next decade that would push some transition to electric vehicles and increase vehicle fuel economy over the course of that decade. In 2017, the Trump administration started a process to roll back on the ambition reflected in those standards. And then yet again in 2021, when the Biden administration came in, they started a program to actually restore the original standards, and ultimately in 2022 put forth a final proposal that actually ratcheted up the standards even more than they had originally been projected. So, as I indicated, these issues across these three major buckets, the administrative actions relating to California's program and whether it's preempted, the actions relating to EPA's own decision making, and then the actions relating to NHTSA's separate but related policy making, are all now in fully briefed, argued, and awaiting decision in the DC Circuit. So the first of these cases, Ohio v. EPA, is the challenge to the Biden administration's reinstatement of the waiver, allowing California to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles. The second, Texas v. EPA, challenges EPA's December 2021 promulgation of its light-duty vehicle greenhouse gas emission standards. And then the third case is the Natural Resources Defense Council v. NHTSA case, which is, again, an industry and I'll call it red state challenge to the Biden administration's fuel economy standards. So I'm going to briefly touch on each and the major legal issues and arguments that have been presented against the policies put forth by the Biden administration, EPA, and NHTSA. So turning first to California waiver. The first issue presented is one that is really quite interesting and novel and constitutional in nature. And this concerns whether Congress, as a constitutional matter, even has properly created this opportunity for a waiver that goes to California and only California, under what's called the equal sovereignty doctrine, which derives from the equal footing doctrine of which relates to the entrance of states. There's a recognition in our constitutional system that all states should have equal rights, so to speak, as they relate to each other. And so a number of the states led by Ohio have first of all made a constitutional argument that 209B, the waiver, which expressly, not expressly, but implicitly and frankly in subsequent litigation or congressional statutory revisions have made quite clear that this is a California-only power. And so there is, first and foremost, a constitutional argument that Congress can't actually pick favorites among states. It cannot regulate states as states and choose among the states. It has to set national policies that, in theory, any state could meet and qualify depending on what the individual criteria are. So novel and interesting argument there that actually the Trump administration kind of foreshadowed could occur because that this issue was cited as a basis to support the interpretation that was taken by the EPA under Administrator Wheeler. But then the red states have taken it a step further and say it's more than a question of constitutional avoidance. This is a question of unconstitutionality. Second, there then is raised by the red states. They continue to argue that even if a Clean Air Act waiver is properly granted, there is no waiver opportunity under the EPCA statute, and California's greenhouse gas emission program is a de facto fuel economy regulation precluded by EPCA. Also at issue raised by the industry petitioners in the challenge to the California waiver is the question of whether EPA exceeded its statutory authority in reinstating the waiver. And in particular, they raise the major questions doctrine, and the fact that granting this power to California and allowing one state to aggressively drive the markets is a question of significant political and economic consequence. And based on that, they argued that climate change is not, for purposes of 209B1B, which is the Clean Air Act statutory provision at issue, a compelling and extraordinary condition, because it is not extraordinary as to California. California is a coastal state, but there are many coastal states, and it's a big state, and it has a climate, and lots of states have climate. And so the idea behind the waiver provision from Congress is not to permit California to do something different than regarding a problem that affects the country as a whole. It's for compelling and extraordinary conditions in California, which is consistent with, of course, the traditional understanding of how and why Los Angeles was an exceptional place for smog, and it was accepted that it needed different and more aggressive standards with respect to conventional pollutants. And by having more aggressive standards, California was able to make some incremental additional progress towards the meeting of those standards. Whereas when you're talking about greenhouse gas emissions and global climate change, there is nothing extraordinary about California that would warrant giving them this special power and waiver as opposed to the rest of the country. So talk a little bit about the Texas v. EPA case, which is the challenge then directly to the standards that have been set by EPA. Once again, Texas and the industry petitioners who are supporting the state of Texas argue and note that this energy transition, trying to drive the country to 67% EV penetration, is one of vast economic and political significance. And so they invoke the major questions doctrine from the West Virginia case and say there must be a clear congressional authorization for Congress, from Congress, for EPA to use these tools. And they argue that the statute's test actually prohibits EPA from setting standards for electric vehicles for greenhouse gas emissions on a fleet-wide average basis. This is an argument that's akin to the fence line rule that the litigants who were representing the power plants, primarily in the West Virginia v. EPA case, argued, and that this same kind of theory applies to how EPA is supposed to look at the regulation of emissions from automobiles, and that it's inappropriate for EPA to set standards for gasoline-powered vehicles that are reliant on their feasibility on manufacturers having, first of all, a fleet-wide average rather than a standard that applies to those automobiles. And this argument is supported by language in Clean Air Act 202 that talks about EPA has to set standards based on classes or on a class or classes of new motor vehicles, and that EVs, they don't emit emissions in the same way. They are a distinct class from ICEs, and therefore that it was statutorily inappropriate for EPA to kind of lump these things together. Getting a little bit into some of the comments that I think are going to follow by Andrew and Mark, there are also arguments that the EPA's rule is arbitrary and capricious. They ignore the life cycle emissions of electric vehicles, focus only on the operation of the vehicle, in the hands of the consumer without regard to the environmental impacts, the broader environmental impacts that come from both the production side as well as the disposal side of electric vehicles, and claim that that the decision has been based on a flawed cost-benefit analysis that assumes that consumers are actually wrong. They don't understand that they want EVs or should want EVs, and they don't understand the benefits of EVs. This is, in short, the theory that underlies the cost-benefit analysis is that consumers' range anxiety, charging anxiety, cold weather anxiety, that's all irrational, and that consumers are missing out and not properly pricing into their own decisions the benefits of owning EVs, including the long-term fuel savings that EPA has calculated. So lastly, is then the challenge by various states and industry to the NHTSA fuel economy regulation. Again, echoing the prior lawsuits, they invoke the major questions doctrine as a support for their statutory interpretations, and argue that NHTSA's rule exceeded its standard setting authority because it first of all, in the view of the challengers, the NHTSA standard bars the consideration of fuel economy from electric vehicles when setting standards for internal combustion engine vehicles. It actually requires NHTSA to consider dual-fueled vehicles when setting those standards, which NHTSA did not do. They did not consider the fueled side, merely the charged electric side of the of plug-in hybrids and the like. And lastly, they make the argument that the statute forbids NHTSA from considering the availability of compliance credits when they're actually setting the standards and determining the feasibility of the standards in the first instance. So how will all these cases shake out is anybody's guess. Many people perceive that the industry and red state petitioners got a pretty hostile reception at the DC Circuit arguments in September. I think that there is a perception that the NHTSA case, which had a different panel than the two EPA cases, is in a little bit a better posture and more likely to generate some positive outcome from the perspective of those who are challenging these policies. But if the NHTSA case is defeated, and only the NHTSA case is defeated, of course, EPA's aggressive standards continue to apply and effectively, continue to drive the EV transition. So, other things to note is what's coming, and to realize that this is only the first round, or the latest round, I should say, because the rounds have been going on and on and on for decades now. And that even as we are litigating over the 2023 to 2027 standards, EPA and NHTSA have both, of course, proposed new standards. Those standards off into the future that get up to the 67% that Administrator Wheeler referred to, of course, rely on the same statutory and legal justifications as these other rules. So if there is an adverse decision for one or more of these programs on the current round of litigation, it has implications for the proposals that are out there. The last wild card of interest for people to be aware of is that most people know that the Chevron doctrine is presently under review at the Supreme Court this term in the Loper Bright Enterprises and Relentless cases. And based on the oral argument, many foes of Chevron are optimistic that Chevron will be curtailed at some level. And there are some that think and hope that it may even be abrogated in its entirety. Certainly, that's what many of the petitioners are seeking. So, depending on how that decision plays out, which will likely occur in June of this year, June of 2024, this summer, the statutory arguments that have been made by the petitioners before the DC Circuit that Congress, for example, would have intended internal combustion engines to be in a different class for purposes of their regulation, feasibility determinations, and other things, as compared to electric vehicles. Those arguments get a whole lot stronger in a world in which there is no Chevron and where you're simply trying to give effect, the best possible reading and effect, to every word of the statute. The current EPA program essentially reads those words out of the statutes. We're just all light duty vehicles are together in one giant program, and we're not differentiating among them for purposes of feasibility. So if you go back and you look at the brief, it's interesting. The United States did not, quite intentionally, obviously, did not cite Chevron when they were defending these rules expressly, but the government did ultimately rely on the Chevron doctrine in supporting its statutory interpretations because they cited other DC Circuit case law that speaks to deference to reasonable interpretations of agency decision. So with that, I will hand it over. Background and history on the legal disputes and bringing us up where we are today. I will hand the discussion over to my fellow panelists.
Oh, well, thank you, Jonathan. That was really quite an excellent overview of the legal issues surrounding the fuel economy and multi-pollutant standard rules. Let me ask you one or two questions, if I may. EPA's argument is that they are not mandating a wholesale industry shift toward EVs. They're just tightening the standards. And that's well within their purview under the Clean Air Act. How would you respond to that?
Well, the response that's been offered by the petitioners in the challenge is that they don't have the authority to do what they're doing the way that they're doing it. It's not that at least with respect to these lawsuits, the argument is not that EPA can't set greenhouse gas emission standards. It's that they cannot create standards which force a transition by virtue of a fleet-wide averaging mechanism that fails to take into consideration the feasibility of regulation and standards as they relate to the internal combustion engine as a separate class of vehicles that consumers want to buy. Many consumers continue to want to buy and prefer for all kinds of reasons other than mere range anxiety and cost, and that batteries, as I mentioned earlier, don't fare particularly well in cold climates in the wintertime, and as well as issues of how you recharge and maintain these things in rural environments and the like. And so the argument is that by failing to differentiate between the internal combustion engine and the electric vehicle engine and throwing them together in one pot, they're essentially forcing the transition by setting unachievable, unfeasible standards for the internal combustion engine in a way that Congress did not contemplate in granting regulatory authority.
Okay. Let me just make one extension of a point you made earlier. If you look at the NHTSA fuel economy rule and the EPA multi-pollutant rule, almost all of the benefits are fuel savings. Even the climate benefits are very, very small in the regulatory impact analyses. And I have made the point in comments and other writings that fuel economy is not really a legitimate benefit of a rule because there's no externality issue narrowly attendant upon fuel economy issues. Consumers can make that choice for themselves. And in the broader sense, it is literally the case that if EPA or NHTSA were to outlaw by regulation motorized vehicles, forcing everyone back into horse-drawn carts and stagecoaches and all the rest, there would be enormous fuel economy savings in the NHTSA EPA methodologies, but there would be no decline in the quality of transportation services. And so it would pass a benefit cost test. That is literally how silly the benefit cost analysis is in the two rules. Um, a point, it's just a bit of an extension of a point you made earlier.
Yeah,
Well, thank
which the
you.
petitioners are making, Ben. That's right.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that excellent overview of the legal issues. I really appreciate it. We'll turn now to Mark Mills, a senior distinguished fellow at the Texas Public Policy Institute. Go ahead, Mark. You are, yeah, good.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, AEI, for the panel and the excellent reviews so far. To me falls the task of talking about reality, a reality check, if you like. As a longtime resident of Washington, D.C., fully recognize that legal and regulatory and policy aspirations and mandates can trump reality briefly, and even for a long time. Congress and regulators, legislators, not only serially violate common sense, they serially violate the laws of nature and the laws of economics, and that's just the way we operate in a democracy. So I'm not going to talk about the rules and regulations, but let me just very briefly highlight some facts that are anchored in physics and engineering realities, what we know about the universe we live in. I'll start with a couple of numbers. We hear all the time about how we had, and Administrator Wheeler began correctly observing that 1 million EVs got sold last year in America, big number out of almost 15 million other new vehicles. Americans bought 50 million, not 15, 50 million vehicles last year. Most vehicles that most Americans buy are used vehicles, 35 million last year. And they buy used vehicles for a very practical and obvious reason. They're cheaper. So I think the context is important here. It's one out of million out of 50 million. The same ratios attend globally, by the way. There aren't many used EVs, and people, as is widely unknown, are not buying them. So the realities are revealed in lots of other numbers. In fact, if I may begin with a quote, an aphorism, if you like, from one of my favorite science fiction writers, because we're dealing in a fiction land here with respect to the aspirations for EVs. Philip K. Dick wrote some time ago that, and it attends to the issues we're discussing, reality is that which still exists even when you stop believing in it. End quote. So that's so let me talk about some realities here. And I'm going to put them in two buckets. First is the core reality, or the core myth that has been turned into a reality, if you like, is anchored in the idea that a transition to EVs involves zero emissions or a radical reduction in emissions. It does not. And I'll explain that in a minute. And then the other realities attend to what are more broadly defined as engineering realities that emerge from the physics of systems that we can build. And those mean, if you think about what's really happening and what's possible, and making forecasts based on the aspirations and the funding and subsidies and mandates that are put in place, long before the US or the world achieves the putative goal of most, if not all, light-duty vehicles becoming battery-powered, long before that happens, to summarize, and I'll amplify briefly on each of these things, we're going to run out of money. And we're going to run out of not rare earth minerals. We're going to run out of copper, a very basic metal. And maybe most importantly, we're going to run out of the patience of most car drivers to put up with profound inconveniences, not just high costs. But let me start with the zero emissions trope, because as Administrator Wheeler correctly pointed out, the CO2 emissions are simply the flip side of fuel efficiency. If you burn oil, if you burn gasoline, it results in power, heat, and you get motion, and you would get carbon dioxide, which is an intentional product, which is a detail of some importance. You burn hydrocarbons in order to cause a chemical reaction that is not a pollutant, but an intentional product. The exothermic reaction of combining carbon and oxygen produces the energy you need, the heat. That's the point of it. And yes, if you cut down the consumption of oil, you can reduce CO2 emissions arithmetically. But here's the sort of the reality calibration point. Today, we saw the Bloomberg and new energy finance people or recently eagerly tout the fact that EVs have already, the tens of millions of EVs in the world have already cut lots of oil use and cut CO2 emissions therefore. But an arithmetical fact that's worth keeping in mind is that even if half of all of the world's cars, and the world has about 1.4 billion cars on roads, even if half of all those cars in the timeframes imagined by the enthusiasts for EVs, even if half of them, and today it's 2% of all vehicles on roads are electrically propelled, but even if half of them are battery propelled, that would displace barely more than 10% of world oil demand. This is not an existential threat to the oil industry, nor is it a profound change in the consumption of oil that the world needs. And even if we get well beyond that, I mean, even if the thought experiment, by the way, it's already been done in practice in Norway, as everyone who follows this issue knows, Norwegians enthusiastically buy EVs, heavily subsidized in that country. Norway has gone from 0% of vehicles on its road to 25%. So they now are 25% of all light duty vehicles on Norwegian roads are now EVs. You can look at the data and one finds that the total consumption of hydrocarbons for road transportation in Norway over that decade, going from 0 to a quarter of all light duty vehicles, the total consumption of hydrocarbons is unchanged in Norway on the roads of that country. Instead, what's been going on in Norway, so I'll get to, is that the Norwegians have been exporting carbon dioxide emissions in the form of the emissions needed to build the vehicles that they're buying, which are dominantly still Teslas, of course, because they're the most popular EV in the world outside of China. So the core trope about EVs is that they will radically reduce CO2 emissions. It is beyond obvious that the entire motivation of the mandates, the laws, the subsidies, the bans on sale of internal combustion engines is entirely anchored in the belief that this will lead to a radical reduction in CO2 emissions. Here's the problem. We know that it won't radically reduce CO2 emissions. In fact, it's entirely possible that it will lead to the same or even higher global emissions of CO2. This is a domain in which we have a bifurcation of facts that we understand. In the hydrocarbon world of combusting liquid fuels to make internal combustion engines operate, we have a great deal of knowledge and precision about the facts with respect to the quantity of emissions in fuel use, but specifically the quantity of emissions associated with getting a road mile. With battery-powered vehicles, we don't. Every number that's been promulgated, every statement, every fact, every study offered by every organization, without exception, that attaches a CO2 emissions reduction for EVs are guesses, approximations, or aspirations based on assumptions about when an EV is driven, where it's driven, when and where it's charged, but much more importantly, where the materials come from, where they're refined, and how they're transported and how they're converted into a battery. The electric vehicle fuel cycle results in significant CO2 emissions elsewhere, not just at the power plants that are used to power the EVs when they're charged, but rather remotely in the domains in which the essential materials are made. The materials to make an electric vehicle are not just lithium, which is beyond obvious for lithium batteries, and cobalt, which is a replaceable material. Many batteries have no cobalt. All batteries have lithium. All batteries have graphite, but more importantly, all batteries use copper. All electric vehicles use copper, and all of them use aluminum. The quantity of copper used per EV is roughly 300 to 400% more per vehicle than a conventional vehicle. In an ironic way, copper being the oldest mined metal known to man, the copper is the long pole in the tent, not a rare metal, but a common metal. The world is not mining enough copper to meet the aspirations that are imagined. The mining of copper, the mining of nickel, the production of aluminum, EVs all use far more aluminum because the battery weighs 1,000 pounds to replace a fuel tank that weighs about 80 pounds. So far more aluminum is used. The mining and production of copper and aluminum alone add significantly to the upstream CO2 emissions. The quantity of those emissions, again, falls into a broad range of possibilities. There is no specific number. Worse, it's not a measurable number. More importantly, it sort of falls in the category of a very wide range, to use that old phrase, of known unknowns. The variability can be as high as 300 to 500% across the well-known range of energy use and emissions from the kinds of mines that access the materials, particular copper, and the kinds of refineries that exist around the world to produce the refined materials that are required, not just refined copper, again, refined graphite, aluminum itself, profoundly energy intensive. It's notable, for example, that 2/3 of the world's aluminum is produced in China on its coal-fired grids. So the extra aluminum needed for all the EVs leads directly and immediately, not theoretically, to a radical increase in the consumption of coal to produce the aluminum necessary for those vehicles. If one looks across the range of these emissions characteristics, again, they're not directly measurable, as are the emissions from a conventional vehicle. You directly measure CO2 emissions by directly measuring the fuel consumed by using the vehicle. You cannot directly measure the emissions of CO2 from an electric vehicle. And the consequence is that we don't actually know. And in fact, the data show that it's entirely possible that the net emissions as time passes, as we expand the production of EVs, the net CO2 emissions will rise globally. We also know that it'll rise arithmetically from a very simple fact, widely known in the geophysical community, is the average ore grade of the materials that we are seeking to manufacture electric vehicles. The average ore grade, the concentration of the metals, that is aluminum, nickel, copper, manganese, and graphite in the rock, is declining and has been declining for centuries. And this is not a mysterious fact. In fact, it was pointed out in the International Energy Agency's own reports and analyses, even though I would say cynically a buried fact. But the simple fact is, it's a geophysical fact, is every next marginal ton of copper, nickel, aluminum, and so forth, the marginal next tons involve far greater use of energy and far greater mining and refining and far more CO2 emissions than the trailing ton. So we don't know how much it's rising, but we do know it's rising. We know the range that it's rising, and the range of increase is in fact nonlinear, because the energy consumption per net new pound of copper, for example, rises non-linearly, that is almost exponentially, as the percentage of the metal you're seeking declines in the ore. So the core trope that it cuts CO2 emissions, to close on that particular point, is worse than wrong. It may actually cause the inverse effect of that hope for. Finally, just very quickly, the other engineering realities about the governments mandating a acceleration into EVs, as Administrator Wheeler correctly pointed out, when governments get involved with aspirations, we get problems. The government can mandate things. The government could, and governments have banned things. One can imagine governments going ahead and doing that. But here's a couple of other engineering facts that just arise from the nature of electricity and the ability to distribute power. Vast majority of electric vehicles that have been sold to date in America, some 90%, are not only to wealthy households, but to households with garages. And they do primarily home charging, which is very convenient for people with a second or third car. And this is where most vehicles have been purchased. The charger, the overnight low power charger, is also a piece of hardware that imposes a downstream hardware cost on the local distribution loop. The power demand, not the energy flowing into the vehicle, but the power demand of the charger is roughly twice the power demand of the house in which it occupies, which means that if every home in a neighborhood decides to put a home charger in their garage, then the power demands of that neighborhood on the grid can double. This is, again, not about the energy to supply, but the actual power demands, or put differently, the size of the transformers. Transformers need to be sized up to handle those power demands. A larger transformer weighs more. That may result in, as many utilities have discovered, not just replacing the transformers, but also the poles in which the transformers are hung, because they're designed for specific weights. And this comes at a time when the availability and costs of transformers, as the availability has declined and the costs have increased roughly 200 to 300% in the last 5 years. If we move to on-road charging, which will be necessary for the EV-dominated world, not just for people who don't have garages, which is 2/3 of American homes, but also for people who have garages that want to drive further than the range of the vehicle. The on-road chargers, in order to be fast charging, require, again, higher power infrastructure. Again, not energy, but power. Higher power requires more expensive hardware, specifically bigger and more expensive transformers. So a fuel station that's on the road today that provides gasoline for convenience of travelers, that fuel station has an electric power demand roughly equal to a 7-Eleven convenience store, a very low power demand. To replicate that fuel station with fast chargers would mean that fuel station will have a power demand of a stadium, football or baseball stadium. The country needs something on the order of 100,000 of those kinds of on-road fuel stations, or put differently, this means we need a hardware infrastructure equal to putting 100,000 ball stadiums on the roads. And if the fuel station is to handle trucks, then the power demand, not energy, will rise to that of a steel mill. And so we'll be installing tens of thousands of steel mill class power demands on the nation's highways. None of the costs of that are being included in or factored in the direct funding or the mandates or the subsidies. These are costs that will total on the order of $300 to $700 billion in capital just for the hardware to distribute the power, not the power plants to make the energy. In fact, the Department of Energy's own national labs have calculated that a 10% penetration of all cars on the roads will require something on the order of $100 billion of distribution and transmission upgrades just to support the superchargers' power demands, not energy. As for running out of copper, we know now, this is not a mystery, that the world is not mining enough copper to meet these aspirations, and nor are the world's mining industries planning to, or have they announced plans to mine enough copper. The copper shortfall isn't here yet. It won't emerge until the demands emerge. If the governments continue here and globally to push copper demands at the levels that are implied from the mandates to build as many EVs and EV batteries as are in the aspirations, then world copper demand will soar and copper supply will fall. In fact, the largest shortfall in copper demand in history is forecast by mining analysts to occur starting in a couple of years. What will that do? Beyond obvious, it'll increase the cost of copper. It will create competition for copper for all other purposes. Copper is largely non-substitutable in most electrical applications, especially for transformers, local distribution, the windings to make electric motors for electric cars, and the power distribution in the electric car itself, all copper. Ivanhoe, CEO, is one of the biggest mining companies in the world, recently pointed out that the competition for copper, because of the shortfall that will emerge if these plans continue, could increase copper prices by tenfold. That would alone add over $10,000 to the price of each EV, never mind the other materials that are required. The same story is attended to essentially all the other minerals, with perhaps the exception of lithium, maybe the easiest one to meet. And in fact, it's easy enough to meet that we're already seeing that the mining industry is pulling back on its plans to expand lithium mining, because the short-term oversupply of lithium for the current state of EVs has caused a temporary price collapse in lithium. So the mining industry is now, let's just say, diplomatically been chastened as to whether or not they really want to invest the amount of capital required to build the hundreds of new mines that will be required and the hundreds of billions of dollars of mining investment that will be required for those mines. Finally, just the last point that what we're going to run out of is the patience of consumers to put up with the inconveniences imposed on them, or the patience of consumers to put up with being told that they have to pay a lot more for the vehicles. The cost of EVs are not going to come down except through price cutting competition that's occurring right now, which will merely increase the losses of the car companies that are fabricating those EVs. That's a temporary price decline. They will have a choice of either not producing EVs or going bankrupt, since you don't make up negative margins by increasing your volume. The trajectory for EV costs is at best flat, that is, they'll stay expensive, or more likely, they in fact will rise. Consumers don't have range anxiety. The average EV's range is roughly the same as the average gasoline car's range. What consumers correctly understand is that it takes a long time to refuel it, and consumers aren't stupid. It's not just the convenience of refueling, it's the timing of refueling. The refueling with fast chargers, which are astronomically more expensive than gasoline pumps, still takes roughly 5 to 10 times longer than refueling with gasoline. Time is precious. People value their time and their convenience. So even if those chargers are installed, even if we can print the money to install them, even if there are enough transformers to power those superchargers, the fueling times remain long. So when faced with this statement of fact, most EV advocates hand-wave innovation, that new classes of batteries will emerge, new magical forms of electrochemistry will emerge and become practical and allow charging at the same rate at which we fuel gasoline. That is entirely possible, but that will take time. The new classes of chemistry that allow rapid charging will take more than a decade to emerge, as has the current class of lithium batteries that are common today. They have taken 30 years to emerge at scales that matter. Lithium battery chemistry is very old and is just now scaled. And even if you have chargers that can charge a battery in 5 minutes, it does not obviate. In fact, it makes more difficult the infrastructure challenge of providing that much power, again, not energy, to the endpoint where consumers need to refuel their vehicles. So the bottom line is the physics and engineering of the sort of accelerating EVs into the market are not just daunting, they make it impossible, frankly, to achieve the goals that are being set out either explicitly or implicitly by states and by the EPA. It won't happen, but we will spend a lot of money along the way and cause a lot of unhappiness. And the magnitude of the money and the unhappiness will simply be determined by how long it takes for people to accept that the reality will put a full stop to all of this. That's it.
Well, thank you, Mark. That was really an excellent overview of the engineering realities attendant upon the EV policy push. Let me ask you one question, if I may. Amid all the assertions about the decline in future greenhouse gas emissions that purportedly are in the offing as a benefit of the expansion of the market share of EVs, or a dramatic expansion in the market share of EVs, which you have shown today is unlikely to happen, and quite the reverse. But nonetheless, if we take those numbers at face value, have you ever seen one of the proponents offer an estimate of the future climate effects, temperature effects, say by the year 2100, of this radical decline in greenhouse gas emissions supposedly to be achieved through this large market substitution of EVs in place of ICEs? Have you ever seen anything like that?
Well, they generally don't do it that way. They take, as you know, because if you use the models themselves to model out the temperature impact of the putative CO2 reductions from EVs, you get trivial,
Right.
fractions of percent of degrees C 50 years from now. But there is a number out there. So if we accept the current Biden administration's EIA's forecast is for the total CO2 reductions for the United States by the year 2035 from spending all the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Act money on wind, solar, and batteries combined. The forecast is for a 2 gigaton per year reduction in US CO2 emissions over a decade from now. That's the forecast, which I reject prima facie because it's not true there'll be those reductions. But if I accept that, what's going on contemporaneous with that is China will finish building their new coal plants. And just as the comparison point, the new coal plants that China is building now, not all the existing, but the new coal plants alone will add 2 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year to the world's same atmosphere. But we will purchase materials from China manufactured with those coal-fired power plants. Their silicon photovoltaic cells, their refined copper, their refined aluminum. So we are going to ship money to China to emit 2 gigatons of CO2 in order to putatively reduce 2 gigatons of CO2 here. So net, if EPA is doing its job, we have zero change in CO2 from those actions, and therefore zero change in future temperature, but at the expense of roughly $3 trillion over the decade deployed on the American economy to achieve no change in the utility function of energy services, and arguably to make the utility function of services worse. So no change in temperature, extremely a big change in where monies flow and a profound change in utility function, which is an economics term for making life less convenient.
Yeah. Well, you will not be surprised to hear that I use the EPA climate model a lot. And it turns out that, just to give you one number, and then we'll turn to Andrew, the entire Biden administration net zero policy, if it were implemented immediately and enforced strictly, under mainstream assumptions reported in the peer-reviewed literature, would reduce global temperatures by the end of the century by 1/10 of 1 degree, which is smaller than the standard deviation of the surface temperature record. Okay, thank you, Mark. And with that, we'll turn to Andrew Studford, the editor of the Capital Matters section of National Review. And unmute yourself there, Andrew, and take it away. Thank you.
Oh, here we are. I hope you can hear me. Well, thank you very much, Ben and AEI, for hosting this event. No one will learn anything from me, but I have learned a great deal from what I've heard from the other panelists. So thank you very much. What I'm going to be talking about is, well, I'll quote what Ben said, essentially, some of the ideological components of what's going on, the drive to force people into central cities, and the loss of freedom that this involves. I should say that in saying what I'm about to say, I am assuming that the policymakers plug on the current course. That, as Mark has highlighted, that may well not happen for practical reasons based in science, physics, available of raw materials. And sooner or later, I suspect that there is going to be a political eruption over this. But what we'll try to show now is if we go to where the climate policymakers want us to go, what that's going to mean. As I do that, have in the back of your mind the Duke of Wellington's complaint. He was a great general, but not perhaps the most progressive of politicians, disapproving of trains, saying that they would only encourage the common people to move around needlessly. And you can see a very clear echo of that attitude with the technocrats who are now steering the drive to EVs. Which could, by the way, a useful phrase I discovered the other day, could be described as radical incrementalism. Step by step, and then suddenly you see you are in a different world. And we're already going down that pathway. I should declare an interest at the beginning, or rather a lack of interest. I live in Manhattan. I don't own a car, and I take the subway. I don't think EVs are bad. I agree with the other people who have been saying that this morning, but I certainly don't think they are ready for prime time. They are a niche product. Let's just see what happens. Because at the moment, what we're seeing is that the more we learn about EVs, the worse they reveal themselves to be. That's especially going to be the case for those for whom the EV would be their only car. I know what we were saying earlier about the typical EV owner is at the moment is pretty wealthy and has other cars. So this unfortunate, the EV is his only car or her only car. They don't have a parking garage or private driveway. What are they going to do? Well, if they live in an apartment building, that apartment building may, depending on the nature of the building, have parking spaces underneath it. Maybe its parking area will be able to bear the extra weight of EVs because they are, as we discussed, they're heavy. Maybe it won't lose too many, this parking space won't lose too many slots because of the need to reduce the risk of fire spreading from vehicle to vehicle, and because of the need to improve access by firefighters to the parking lots. Firefighters, yes, EVs don't catch fire so often as traditional cars. In fact, the reverse is true. But when they do catch fire, those fires are far more difficult to put out. And of course, in the confined space of a parking lot, of an enclosed parking lot, particularly in a building, that can be possibly certainly a cause of unease. And so what we have seen is that our poor urban apartment dweller with his EV is going to have to hope that so far as his or her building is concerned, that the residents or the insurers or even lawmakers are not going to stop the installation of charging facilities which would be needed for the dedicated parking space for that building. And, the fire risk of EVs, I think, is overstated, but the fear is real enough. And for example, South Korea has prohibited the installation of chargers below the second basement level. And I think you're going to see a lot of unease about that. So where are they going to park their cars? Just leave that question hanging there. If they have parking facilities located outside these buildings, charging facilities could be installed. It won't be cheap, nor will their maintenance. And there will have to be fewer slots again because of fire risk, although it's less of a worry than in enclosed spaces. But then, of course, you'll be exposed to the cold, the elements. So we've talked about the cold. The electric vehicle owner will have to hope that it just doesn't get too cold. And winter has a way of getting too cold, as people in Chicago discovered recently, where there was basically an electric vehicle fiasco with cars running out of juice before they could get refueled. And by the way, the electric vehicle owner will also have to hope, if he's parking outside, that it doesn't get too hot, because that too hits battery range, basically. But what about EV owners who live in a building without a dedicated parking space? They'll either have to pay for a parking garage or a parking lot with charging facilities to the extent they exist. And in some cities, that's difficult enough as it is, and this is likely to get worse. Because what we're seeing here, to understand EVs, one must see them as part of a more generalized war against cars. Parking lots have been added to the ever-expanding list of enemies of the planet. In a report in the New York Times last March, Jane Margolis explained that the country was awash with parking space due to arcane zoning rules mandating off-street parking for new real estate developers. And of course, America's, and they always have something like this, love affair in this case with automobiles, although we are later on told that Americans were in thrall to the car. In thrall? Maybe they just liked them and found them convenient. The car was the engine of post-war prosperity, progress, and modernity, underpinning the spread of the suburbs that were and are, and still are, whatever they tell you, part of the American dream. Sprawl is just great. But according to Margolis, times are changing. In city after city, these old parking rules are being struck down, meaning that you don't have to make so many parking lots. She says sites are working from home as to one reason why that's the case, and that's probably right. But that's not anyone who favors flourishing urban economies should want. Cutting down on parking spaces, not to speak of destructive absurdities such as Manhattan's imminent congestion charge, will damage cities, not enrich them. We live in an age of compulsion. There's a libertarian case to be made that developers should not be compelled to add parking spaces to get the permission for a new project. But no such argument can be made in favor of setting a maximum number of spaces. But that's what's beginning to happen. And the social engineering doesn't stop there. Instead of parking, writes Margolis, some developers provided allowances for mass transit, of course, and bike use or rental car sharing arrangements. California recently capped parking in cities with, quotes, robust mass transit, whatever that may mean. We shouldn't be surprised. The collective is trumping the individual, with the lone exception of the sweaty cyclist. Margolis argues that parking spots won't be missed, given the decline in car ownership among millennials. That's a myth. It was debunked years ago, and the next generation after looks like going to go the same way. And the demand for cars is fairly for car auto transportation is it's solid, and that's why policymakers are so frightened of it and are trying to compel it away. We know that people like, given the choice, and not just Americans, they prefer cars. They like the autonomy and the privacy that comes with them. To take one example, in 2013, Tallinn, the Estonian capital, stopped charging fares on public transport. The reasons were not connected to climate policy. That led to a 6.5% increase in passengers 2012 over 2014, but thereafter it's only increased by 1% a year. COVID was an exception. Over the same period, however, the percentage of those driving to work increased from 40 to 50%, and the jump was even higher among the city's poorest, who took advantage of Estonia's growing prosperity to switch to cars. In 2013, less than a fifth of city dwellers, of low-income residents of Tallinn drove to work. 9 years later, despite the free public transport, that share had more than doubled. Poorer city dwellers, Duke of Wellington wouldn't have approved. They like to drive too. Our technocracy doesn't like it. And yet the coming of EVs and the eventual displacement of traditional cars will mean that poorer drivers' ability to keep driving is going to be sharply curtailed. Will the parking apartment blocks where they live have the space for them to charge their EVs? If they can afford the cost of an EV, as Mark was making clear, they're going to be expensive. If they live in row houses, will they be able to charge the cars they have to park on the street? Would they be able to find reliable charging stations? The questions answer themselves. And if these reprobates cling, to borrow a verb from President Obama, to their traditional cars, the going won't be easy. In some European cities, older cars, more typically owned by poorer people, are effectively banned in so-called low emission zones. In London, they're not banned, but you have to pay a very steep daily fee. Wealthier drivers, however, have little reason to feel smug, even if they drive an EV. EV drivers will start having to pay London's notorious congestion charge from 2025, and it looks as if EV drivers are not going to escape New York's congestion charge. Meanwhile, in Paris, after a mighty vote in which about 5% of the population voted, extra and hefty parking charges will be levied on hefty cars, and those will include EVs. The EV is not spared, which is again a problem because they tend to be heavier than traditional cars. In Britain, meanwhile, speed limits on hundreds of roads have been reduced from 30 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour for reasons that have seemed to me to owe far more to harassment of the motorist than safety considerations. Be caught speeding at 25 miles an hour more than 4 times and you could lose your license for a year. Planners in Dublin are now considering severe restrictions on cars in the city centre. Partly, we are told, to allow for the creation of 15-minute cities within the Irish capital. 15-minute cities are a neo-medieval, supposedly voluntary concept that, though voluntary, which have become the stuff of some wild conspiracy theories. But even if we disregard those, these voluntary, splendid schemes, which everyone will like so much, seem to bake in a great deal of compulsion. There is naturally also talk of extensive pedestrianisation, an idea that has its place here and there, but taken to extremes, as it will be, risks turning parts of large cities into dull, lonely barracks, islands of isolation. And will EVs be spared these restrictions? They will not. The war against cars is not and will not be confined to those with an internal combustion engine. And for those of you who live outside city centres and you have your parking garages or private driveways, no reason to relax. There is growing grumbling that EVs are not quite the answer to climate change that we have led to believe, as Mark has explained today and frequently and invaluably in his writing. And there are, environmentalists know very well the greenhouse gas emissions generated in the course of manufacture of EVs and so on means they just simply aren't as environmentally friendly as advertised. There are even concerns about the particulates thrown out by their tires. It's a sort of a new and trendy form of pollution that has been identified. and there's more of it from EVs. Again, that's a function of their greater weight. Their greater weight makes them more likely to crash through guardrails, which typically take up to about 5,000 pounds, and EVs and some conventional cars can be more than that. And then you don't want to be on the wrong end of a collision with an EV. So that's going to mean the environmentalists are not going to give EVs much slack for long. And meanwhile, what about the existing cars? I would find it next to impossible to support a ban on conventional cars under any circumstances. But the more reasonable of those policymakers prepared to countenance such a thing ought to think that at the moment, EVs are not yet at the stage, and again, I refer you to Mark, where they could justify the squeezing out of the latter. In fact, it may even be impossible, if we stick to the reality, for them to be in a position to do so. But such perhaps imaginary reasonable policymakers will gain some reassurance from the reality that the longer that EVs have to compete against the internal combustion engine, the better they ought to be. As Henry Ford could tell you, competition works. The internal combustion engine prevailed over competing technologies without the help of a ban on horses, steam cars, or the EVs of their day. That's not likely how it's going to be to work out this time round. I mentioned this in an article the other day. The usual Puritans who grumble about American car bloat, they're getting larger and larger. That's now, their opinions have been given a sharper edge by the arrival of the EV heavy brigade. And what they're saying is that it's been a mistake to tell Americans that their EVs will offer the same experience as conventional autos. We're told that the non-battery part of the car will have to be smaller. That means less range because the battery is very heavy. Or perhaps the size could be left the same, but with a smaller battery, and that's less range. The rest of the car in the previous example would be smaller to allow the sizable battery. Or perhaps, and I think this is more likely, they could be smaller and have lower range, a grim little buggy fit for our carbon pairing age. So it seems that these reasonable climate policy makers are going to be ignored, that is, if they exist. Instead, unless reined in by political pushback, climate policy makers, or the big question about reality, climate policy makers will continue to squeeze out or try to squeeze out conventional cars while nudging automakers who are now more or less wards of the state to scale back the size and the attributes of the EVs they're currently making or proposing to make. Some of that nudging may include, by the way, weight-based car taxes, already a thing in some countries and to a small extent in a couple, but in Washington, D.C., and in New York, where it's very low at the moment, but will increase. That's not something that American consumers are going to appreciate. They're already losing their taste for EVs, and they won't be thrilled by the prospect of buying successors that are likely to be, even worse than the current generation of EVs, and certainly inferior when it comes to conventional competition. But if the regulators get their way, they will have nowhere else to turn to, and they are going to be expensive. Bloomberg is a news service that, reflecting the preferences of its proprietor, offer a good window into where the climate warriors are headed. It was thus interesting to read an article it ran last year praising Peachtree City, which is a suburb of Atlanta. Because, of course, the question of the suburbs is a uniquely American issue, or much more of an American issue than elsewhere. And what the writer really wanted was, looking at how they ran Peachtree City in Atlanta, was turn these little areas, exurbs, suburbs, into once car-dependent towns into fertile territory for golf carts, as well as e-bikes, e-trikes, and various battery-powered microcars. I don't think that's going to work too well in a Buffalo suburb in January. There may be one type of getaway car, which is the hybrid. They do look like quite an impressive, logical solution to many of the problems thrown up by the transition to EVs. I'm not sure how long they will be allowed to survive given the, and again, I'll use a word that Mark used, the punitive nature of environmentalism. Humanity has sinned and is meant to be punished for its overconsumption. Driving off in a Toyota Prius isn't going to fit that bill. You look for quotes, the Sierra Club, they just said, Catherine Garcia, chair of their Clean Transportation for All, was quoted as saying, we have to reduce the number of solo trips. The Jesse Hickel, who is an advocate of degrowth, a rather sinister development, but he has a position with the National Academy of Sciences, argues in favor of a switch to EVs, but then their numbers will have to be radically reduced. Many share such opinions. And it is thus easy to think that those drivers who are planning to cling to the internal combustion engine by hanging on to their old car or using the second-hand market are going to be disappointed. The automakers and the climate hawks will form a bootleggers and Baptist coalition that will force second-hand traditional cars off the market, basically by regulation for the ever stricter emission standards. And if left unchecked, which I hope it won't be, this part of the broader war against mobility, check out what climate warriors are saying about flying, will represent not only a technological step back, but a fundamental erosion of our rights. Our individuality suppressed will become a malleable collective, crammed into supposedly sensible spaces that technocrats have devised for our own good. And to wrap up, it was CEI's Richard Morrison who wrote about the Estonian transit scheme for us for Capital Matters. He quoted Waldemar Hanash, who was once the CEI, may still be, who had lived in communist Poland. He had this to say after living under communism. My car gives me the opportunity to travel, to learn, to meet other people, to enjoy life. It expands my choice of where to live, where to work, where to dine, where to shop. The privacy of car ownership is a major part of this liberty. People buy cars not only to travel from one place to another, but to enjoy many things while they travel. Music, conversations with friends, landscapes and sunsets. It's not only my home, it is my castle. My Toyota is my castle too. Underlying all this is the freedom to choose where to go and when to go and whom to go with. Westerners take these liberties for granted. Survivors of communism do not. And there's something else for Americans. One of the ideas underlying this continent spanning, and I speak as an immigrant nation, is the ability just to go, drop everything and hit the road, something I love doing, I might say. For most, it's a myth, but the idea is there, and it's a part of what being American is. For that to be torn away will leave us severely diminished. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. That was, as I expected, a good overview of the ideological and social kind of implications of the EV policy push. We do have a question from one attendee. It's really rather straightforward. Should we ban EVs altogether? I think all of us are in agreement that if a given individual wants to buy an EV, that's his or her business. It's really not a public policy issue. The issue is whether the policies promoting a massive market shift toward EVs are sensible in terms of appropriate goals for public policy. Andrew, let me ask you this, if I may. For many decades, the political or ideological forces looking askance at automobiles as a personal mode of transportation have criticized urban sprawl and the growing decentralization of the U.S. population toward suburban, exurban, and rural areas, et cetera. And it seems to me clear, and if I'm wrong, I need to hear it, that one political objective is to force a population shift back into urban areas. If that is the case, what do you think is the overriding objective of the ideological push toward a re-centralization of population living standards. Why do the proponents of EVs want this? A re-centralization of population living patterns.
I think that it is, and they do, that they do. It is a simple matter of if you force if you force populations together, or force the population together into a fairly dense space, they are easier to control. They're more malleable if they take public transport. They are, for example, may well be at the mercy of trade unions. As anyone who takes the railways in the UK knows, when they're held hostage to strikes by the rail unions or the tube unions and so on and so forth. But I think it is a deep-seated ideological sort of, probably something I can't even quite explain themselves, but it's to do with control, discipline, getting people. I mean, think of Corbusier's cities in the 1920s and 30s. Terrible, but this is just an extension of that that sort of urban vision. And I think there's also the Puritanism, and in America in particular, it is absurd. The objection to sprawl is there's this feeling that we are Americans are a wasteful people, and that a symbol of the sprawl is the suburb, and the individual gratification that it gives the people who live there is something that the left find at a sort of emotional level rather distasteful. One of the ironies to all this is quite a lot on both sides of the fence, but let's talk about the left, are worried about falling rates of population growth. But it seems to be, it doesn't worry me actually, but people do worry about it. You often hear about this, but if you pack people into crowded cities, they are much less likely to have more children than if you allow them to sprawl out into the suburbs, which is where they want to go.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments from Jonathan or Mark before we adjourn?
I will just add that of the question that you referred to from a listener, watcher, about banning EVs, obviously a very bad idea, but banning the bans would be a terrific idea. The 12 states that will ban the ability to purchase a new vehicle with an internal combustion engine is a lunatic. That's what we should be banning, the intrusion of the government into these markets.
Well, Mark, that's actually what one of the lawsuits in the DC circuit is about. They think that Congress already did many, many years ago. Or or the red states are even taking the position that the founders did 200 some years ago.
This is the lesson I got from living in the swamp of Washington, D.C., that despite the physics and economic realities, the lawyers get to trump the game both on causing the problem and solving it. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jonathan and Mark and Andrew, and thank you to all our online attendees. This has been a very interesting discussion for me, certainly, and we hope to continue this discussion in further events at AEI. Thank you again.